For the first time this year, we are taking one of our looks around the Canadian Hockey League, and we are joined by the voice of the Peterborough Petes, that is Stew Kernan, as we look at the OHL's East Division, which contains his Petes, along with the Oshawa Generals, Ottawa 67s, Kingston Frontenacs, and Brantford Bulldogs. We'll start off, Stu, what is this season looking like for the East Division? Who are the contenders? How do you see things shaping down?
Well, you know what, Patrick? It looks like it might be quite similar to what we saw last season as far as who is going to kind of dominate. The Ottawa 67s look like they're going to have another strong team this year. 107 points last year. You would think there would be a major fall off. They've won 3 of the last 4 seasons. They've took the Hamilton Spectator Trophy with the top record in the OHL, but have made it to the OHL finals just once in those 4 years. But despite that and the disappointment of losing to the Petes in the second round of last year's playoffs, they're bringing back 13 players from last year's team. Even though the Petes were able to beat them last Friday night in the 67's home opener, it's looking like they're going to have another pretty strong team who will be one of the teams to contend in the Eastern Conference.
It's interesting. They're a strong team, and obviously rebuilding is a big part of Major Junior. But you have the last 2 league champions in your division, and of course it was your Peterborough Petes winning last year for the first time since 2006. Just walk us through what was a memorable playoff run, maybe not the start the Petes were expecting to have, and then from 4th in their conference, they come out in the playoffs and win some big games on the road, win a title. Just tell us about that run.
The run was incredible. We had a pretty decent first half of the season and then, of course, made all kinds of changes at the trade deadline after Christmas. And I'm sure you've seen it many a times in your years in junior hockey that when you do that many changes and bring in so much high-end talent, you're hoping that it's going to work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And the Petes were pretty inconsistent after the changes were made in January. And as you mentioned, they finished 4th in the conference. Certainly didn't dominate. But you know what? I think I saw about 2 weeks before the regular season ended that things started to gel. You saw guys kind of buy into the roles that the coaching staff had kind of laid out. And then, of course, when the playoffs hit, the team just took off and came up with some huge performances all throughout the playoffs, both at home and on the road. The Petes were 10-1 on home ice during the playoffs, and then, of course, made it all the way to the OHL finals and beat London, and then went on to the Memorial Cup out in Kamloops. And so it was a great run, very memorable for the city, as you mentioned. It's been 17 years since the Petes won the OHL title, so it was a long time coming, but certainly was a lot of fun, and the guys played their hearts out.
And one key player in that whole operation is Owen Beck, a name that I think even fans outside the OHL probably know because he was on the World Junior team. He's a draft pick of the Montreal Canadiens, now coming back to Peterborough for his 19-year-old season. Just tell us about him and how he projects as a pro going forward. And I'm assuming if Peterborough is not contending this year, he would be a valuable trade chip for someone else in the OHL.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Unfortunately, Owen's going to miss one more game because of a suspension he received during the playoffs. So we won't see him on the Petes next game Thursday night. But it'll be interesting to see going forward how the Petes handle it. Obviously, whether they'll wait for the trade deadline and see if they're in a contention for a playoff spot and possibly higher up in the standings, or like they did with goaltender Michael Simpson last week, decide to trade a valuable asset before the season even started, or when the season gets 2, 3, 4 weeks in. We'll have to see, but he was a big part of the Petes run to the OHL championship, and he had a great Memorial Cup and was a very, very valuable commodity. And yeah, Montreal has a very good prospect. He got called up for 1 game last year. He played in an emergency situation, and then, of course, is just returning from the training camp after playing a couple of preseason games. So Montreal has a good one. The Canadiens did make some moves that might have hurt his chances of sticking with the club this year, but it's a young Montreal club that's rebuilding, and I think Owen Beck's going to be a big part of it.
No doubt about that. Of course, we like to talk about things going on off the ice as well, and we're looking at the OHL's East Division. The big news story in the offseason is the permanent/not permanent relocation of the Hamilton Bulldogs to Brantford. They're all in on the Brantford moniker, and they're going to be there for a few years with the possibility of moving back to Hamilton. Walk us through that situation from your perspective. Seems like there's good support for the team. Could this be a permanent change? Just what is the general vibe in Ontario regarding this temporary but possibly permanent relocation of the Bulldogs?
It's a very interesting situation. I spent 3 years in Hamilton when they were the Hamilton Bulldogs from 2016 to 2019, and the team has had some success in Hamilton. They've gone to the Memorial Cup twice, 2018 and 2022. The reason they moved to Brantford is because of renovations to the arena, First Ontario Centre, that the Bulldogs play in. So they had to find another place to play, and Brantford came a-calling, and they've done everything in their power to welcome the Bulldogs to Brantford. They've done a lot of renovations, millions of dollars of renovations to their arena. It's their hope that this is a permanent move, and that when the 3-4 years are up, whatever it might be, that the Bulldogs or possibly another team in the Ontario Hockey League will call Brantford home. So it's going to be very interesting. I know the owner of the Bulldogs, of course, is Michael Andlauer, and he's the recently newly appointed owner of the Ottawa Senators. So it's going to be interesting to see how Michael handles that situation. He was in Hamilton a long time, both in the American Hockey League with the Bulldogs and then transitioning to the Ontario Hockey League, and he wanted a new building in Hamilton and has wanted a new building for years, wasn't able to work with the city council to get it done. There's a lot of people that think that the Bulldogs won't be back in Hamilton, but we'll see what happens over the next few years.
We talked about Owen Beck. Looking through the division, I see 3 other players who were drafted in the first 2 rounds of the NHL draft. Callum Ritchie, first rounder of Colorado, playing in Oshawa. Another second-round pick, Rasmus Kupalainen of Minnesota, is also with him in Oshawa. And then you have Paul Ludwinski, who plays in Kingston, a Chicago draft pick. Just tell us your perspective on those 3 guys, seeing them as opposition when they play the Petes.
We've seen a lot of Ludwinski over the years, along with Callum Ritchie and Oshawa. Both very good players. They're going to be big parts of their team. Oshawa's going to be improved. Kingston, of course, missed the playoffs by just 1 point last season, so they're looking to take a step forward. They still had a couple of NHL guys missing when the Petes beat them on opening night last Thursday, but those are 2 big players that are going to be huge for the success of those particular 2 teams. Callum Ritchie, if he has the season, I think a little bit of a disappointing season last year, even though he went into his NHL draft year and went high in the NHL draft. I think the Generals were expecting a little bit more out of Callum Ritchie, but from what we understand, he's had a good training camp in the NHL, and he's going to be a big part of the Oshawa Generals going forward. So all 3 of those players, of course, are very big players, and for those 2 teams specifically to have success, they're going to have to play a big part in it. No doubt they probably will.
Speaking of the Oshawa Generals, there was a story in the spring about how the owner was making waves about potentially relocating the team to Pickering in the early 2030s, which sounds far away, but it is actually really not that far away. Has that picked up any traction? It's hard to imagine one of the signature CHL franchises. Do you think of Bobby Orr and Eric Lindros playing there? Is this something on the radar still?
Rocco Tullio is the owner of the Oshawa Generals. He's also a minority owner with Michael Andlauer with the Ottawa Senators. So I think because of that, a lot of the talk about the Generals and a possible move has kind of died down, and we haven't heard much about it. Not the first time that Mr. Tullio has gone that route to try to get a better deal with the city of Oshawa, whether it's a negotiating ploy, not for me to say. I'd be very surprised to see the Generals leave the city of Oshawa. That's a big part of that city and that community. I'm sure negotiations, they go back and forth for months, sometimes years. And for the Oshawa Generals, there always seems to be something that comes up during the off season before a season starts, but then quickly it goes away. But as you mentioned, there's some communities out there that would love to have OHL hockey. You talked about Pickering, not too far away from Oshawa, and that's a growing community in the greater Toronto area. So I'm sure they would love to have an Ontario Hockey League club, and there's others down the list as well. But for me, I'd be very surprised to see the Oshawa Generals pick up and leave town.
Certainly don't want to see anybody lose their team. Like to focus on the future as well. Speaking of the Oshawa Generals, they have a player by the name of Beckett Senenek who could potentially sneak into the first round of the NHL draft. He's a forward for Oshawa, and it looks like Henry Mews, a defenseman in Ottawa, is almost certainly going to go in the first round of the NHL draft. I know those guys would have been just 16 last year, but any early impressions on those 2 guys, perhaps the future in the OHL and future NHLers perhaps as well?
No doubt about it. They're both very talented players. Of course, we saw a lot of both of them playing in our division. And of course, we saw Henry Mews again, who I think really took another step forward during the playoffs for the Ottawa 67s. And I think he's going to be a highly sought after defenseman in the upcoming NHL draft. First, second round, no doubt about it. Seneca as well for the Oshawa Generals. I think what we're kind of looking to see what he brings to the table this year. Not going to say he was undersized by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm sure another another year growth. I'm sure it'd be very interesting to see how his off season went as far as conditioning is concerned, getting a little bit stronger. And I think if he does that, he was already a good player at 16. I think his potential going forward is going to be huge.
You know, we talked about Ottawa earlier having a lot of star power, their lineup, some NHL draft players there as well. I like to ask the OHL guys about this. If you had a chance to see Colin McKenzie play between the pipes, because I know he's in a veteran goaltending tandem, he's got some ties to Cape Breton. Did you get a chance to see him play against Peterborough last year?
We did. We saw him play Friday night. He was in the nets for Ottawa when the Petes were there and beat them 5-2. He had a little bit of a shaky night. He had a couple of adventures out of the crease area behind the goal that resulted in a couple of Pete's goals. But we saw a lot of him last year. He was part of the 67's success all season long and into the playoffs. And he's a good goaltender. They have their goaltending tandem back. Max Donasso is the other goaltender in Ottawa. They're both back this season. So that's another reason why the 67's, I think, are going to have another strong team because of those two goaltenders. I think from what we understand, Dave Cameron again this year is going to play them both. I'm not going to say there isn't going to be a number one goaltender in Ottawa, but I think he's going to take some time to figure out who's going to get that number one tag. But I think Colin McKenzie is very capable of taking that role and helping the Ottawa 67's get past a little bit of a bugaboo they've had the last few years. As we mentioned, they've won 3 of the last 4 seasons, the top position in the Ontario Hockey League in the overall standings, but they haven't got the ultimate prize in that getting to the Memorial Cup.
We're watching Colin in Cape Breton. His grandfather was a very popular high school principal around these parts. We have to ask about Connor Massey working in the Pete's office because he's the former game day operations manager here in Cape Breton, and he now works with the Pete's. How's Connor getting along there in Peterborough?
Got a great chance to get to know Connor throughout the playoffs last year. He was on the road as well as at home doing a lot of social media and game reports for the Petes. He's doing a great job. He picked a great time to come to Peterborough and join the Petes organization last season. And he was there all throughout, also out at the Memorial Cup in Kamloops, British Columbia. The Petes have a good one there, and their off-ice staff did a great job last year. A lot of sellouts for the Petes second half of the season and, of course, all throughout the playoffs, and started this year with a sellout for opening night. Connor's a part of that very important off-ice staff that every junior hockey club needs to have.
If people know about watching games in Peterborough that's unique is those square boards. Do those provide any sort of challenges for a broadcaster, and how does that affect the game from what you can tell?
Not so much for me as a broadcaster. Obviously, it does for the opposition. And every once in a while, you see the Petes get fooled by it, too, because when you get into those square corners, the puck can take some pretty strange bounces. I remember when I was with the Sudbury Wolves and doing games for Sudbury, we played Peterborough in a playoff series, and the Wolves took a whole practice to try to get used to those square boards. And a famous story as well is when the London Knights took on the Peterborough Petes back in 2006 in the playoffs. Dale Hunter, the head coach of the London Knights, went to the OHL and wanted the league to fix those square corners and put them back just like every other rink. But that's one of the unique characters of junior hockey rinks. I think every rink has something. For Peterborough, it's the square corners, and that's nothing that's going to change in the near future. We'll have to see. There's been some talk about possibly a new building in Peterborough in the next 5 to 10 years, and we'll have to see what happens if they decide to build a new building, if they'll take those square corners with them.
You can still bask in the championship from last year, Stu, but hopefully you enjoyed this season as well. Thanks for telling us all about the things going on with teams in the OHL East Division.
It's been a lot of fun. Last year was great. It was very enjoyable, and got to see, obviously, Patrick Roy and the Quebec Remparts at the Memorial Cup last year. So got a little taste of, we don't see a lot of, obviously, the Western League and the Quebec Junior Hockey League. So it's always fun to get caught up, and looking forward to another great season. And hopefully everything goes well for you and your squad as well.
Well, we appreciate that. Some great insight on the OHL coming from Stew Kernan, the voice of the Peterborough Petes here at the intermission. You're listening to Celtic Kubota, Cape Breton Eagles Hockey, 1270 CJCB.